Welcome to SmallTalk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of SmallTalk, I'm going to be joined by Joshua Skarf, who is an architect based in Yerushalayim and is the author of the book ArchitecTorah, Architectural Ideas in Judaism, and the weekly Torah portion published by Urim Publications, so something a little different and unique. So thank you, Josh, for joining me.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
So, what can you tell me about this book?
Well, before let me thank you for having me on the podcast, and also for the wonderful service that you provide to the Jewish world for who want to stay up to date on the latest publications. It's really a useful tool, and it's great to be able to follow this and know everything's there. So, as you said, the title of the book is ArchitecTorah, Architectural Ideas in Judaism, in the weekly Torah portion. The name ArchitecTorah is a play on words, since the Hebrew for architecture is ArchitecTorah, also the Latin, and so obviously here it's, instead of ArchitecTorah, we have ArchitecTorah, a book about architecture that's structured around Parshat HaShavua. For each parsha, it contains at least 2 divrei Torah that explore an architectural topic connected to the psukim. The essays, I try to keep them short. They're usually 2 to 3 pages. Some of them get to 4 or 5, and maybe there's a handful that are longer. Obviously, some parshiot contain more architectural topics than others, so for many of the parshiot, I have more than 2. Altogether, there are 178 topics, chapters in the book, and I wanted to give the reader their money's worth. And also, it just reflects how many architectural topics there are in the Torah, which I guess does surprise people.
Yeah, there definitely are. It's not surprising. Obviously, we know of them, but opening this book and looking through it, I've seen that, oh, wow, that's really architecture. You really can build on that architecturally. So it's something unique. I don't know if you're familiar, like, if anyone else did a book like this on the Torah, just on architecture. And explain a little more to the listener, like, obviously you're writing essays based on architecture, but like, example, like, what does that mean? What is give them a flavor of what this book does, parsha to parsha?
Okay, let me see. As I said, most people are surprised that there's enough architectural material to fill a 600-page book. And when you ask somebody to list what architecture there is in the Torah, they'll usually come back with Noah's Ark and the Tower of Babel and the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And I guess it's true that those are the only complete building projects that are discussed in the Torah. But the field of architecture really contains so many topics, such a wide array of issues, that there's much, much more to talk about. When Vitruvius, who was a 1st century BCE Roman architect, wrote his manual, the 10 books on architecture, he talked about different components of the building, principles of design, city planning, siege machines, drainage, brick making, what type of sand to use for different purposes, acoustics, pigments, sundials, the list goes on. And I generally relied on that book to determine whether a subject was architectural enough to write about it in my book. It's also true that we live in a built environment, and much of the Torah took place in a built setting. So many stories in the Torah have an architectural backdrop. We find stories that revolve around windows and doors, or kitchens, jails, grain silos, thrones, access roads, bridges, building material, city walls. And so by forcing myself to look at the Torah through the lens of architecture, with the focus on architectural design, I found that I was able to hone in on these aspects that take place either in the background or in the foreground, and find overlooked context or messages that are in the familiar psukim right there for us to see. And that led to a lot of novel insights into the verses. As a side benefit, hopefully I'm able to introduce the readers some interesting architectural topics that they might not have noticed, or then by doing so, allow them to more thoughtfully consider their day-to-day environment. In terms of the style of the Divrei Torah, typically I start with a question that different Meforshim raise, and I briefly summarize some of the classical Rishonim approaches of the classical Meforshim, and then I will introduce an architectural topic, maybe a piece of theory, maybe some building code, an example of an existing building, and discuss it briefly, and then with that in mind, re-examine the question that's posed by the Meforshim and come up with a new way of looking at the topic. As I said, I tried to keep the essays short and accessible, but at the same time, I wanted them to be there to be plenty of information for people looking to go more in depth on the subject, whether that's from the side of rabbinic literature or whether it's from the side of architectural writing. So I made sure to include a lot of relevant references in the footnotes. Sometimes I highlight a perush that or a discussion in the Talmud that is architectural, that revolves around architecture. Some of the topics have to do with actual buildings. Others refer to halachic topics like, let's say, guardrails or privacy or tzarat in buildings or sukkah balconies. Some relate to architectural theory like tectonics and stereotomics or light quality, parcelization, acoustic design. And some have to do with archaeology and how things were built in the ancient world, what we would call realia, and how that might inform our understanding of the stories.
Yeah, and that final point that you just made is give some examples. Like in Parashas Mikes, you'll do it says just the throne. Parah tells Yosef. So you say, oh, Pharaoh's throne. You have an article on Pharaoh's throne, and then you go into Medrash a little bit. It says they went down, and the Parashas say, oh, because they were going to bring the wood down that we're going to need for the Mishkan, and they left Mitzrayim. So you go, well, the lumber for the Mishkan is architect. You go into the lumber, and you discuss that through Medrash. So that's another thing. Something that you do in Shemais, you'll go into brick making in Egypt. You go into Egyptian temples and the plagues when that comes up. Houses during the plagues. It says that Tzfardea went into the houses. Well, what were the houses like during the plagues? And these are so sometimes it's actually like just to give an example for the listeners of what you're trying to do.
Would you like me to give some more examples?
Yes, for sure. If you have some more examples, I'm just trying to at least show the listener just through what it is, and also it is a pretty large book, as you mentioned. It's 600 pages. It's a pretty big book with an index. I mean, you do go through a fair amount of things. So yes, if you can give some examples, I think would be good, helpful for the listeners.
Terrific. Well, so we're at the start of Shmot right around now, and so maybe some examples from the start of that sefer. I talk, for example, about Bnei Israel were living separately in Goshen. And according to some of the Meforshim, that played a role in the disobedience of the midwives. They were able to hide the cries of the Jewish babies. And according to the Midrash, when Paro realized this, he wanted to integrate the neighborhoods by moving Egyptians into the Jewish neighborhoods. And this, by the way, explains how Bnei Israel went from living separately to living together with the Egyptians, which made it necessary to pass over the houses during Makat Bechorot. I then get into a discussion about what it means to live in a ghetto versus in a mixed neighborhood, and about how modern city planners champion mixed-use neighborhoods, where there's a desire to have a mixture of building types so that it's not necessary to drive across town to go to work, or so that some parts of town aren't completely abandoned during certain times of day. That's sort of in modern town planning. In Egypt, ethnic segregation is presented as something that allows Bnei Israel to hide their practices from the Egyptians, though ghettos haven't exactly worked out so well for us historically. You mentioned the role of straw in brick making, and there's certainly a lot of scholarly information about how bricks were made in the ancient world. The issue with mud bricks is their strength, and in order to make sure that they don't crack, you need to add a binder in with the mud, and in our case that's the straw. But bricks were made months or years before they could actually be used. They needed to dry properly so that they would be strong enough. And at that point, if they do develop cracks because no binding material was used, well, go figure out which slave is to blame for that specific brick. And so therefore, I imagine that when Paro decreed that the Egyptians would no longer give out straw to Bnei Israel when they were making the bricks, that the obvious and obstinate response on the part of the slaves would be to say to themselves, fine, you don't want to give us straw? We'll make the bricks without straw. And go figure that out. So Paro therefore insists that the slaves continue to use the same matkonet of bricks, which commentators usually interpret as the same quantity of bricks as they made before, but I suggest means more like in line with the modern Hebrew word matkon for recipe for bricks, and that he was insisting that they, even though they were not getting straw, they needed to continue to use straw in the recipe. Incidentally, brickmaking is also identified in ancient building manuals as a springtime activity, which is again tied to the idea of properly drying the bricks out. And it reminds us that even though Bnei Israel were busy with making bricks, this was probably one of many tasks. It was probably a seasonal thing that they did during springtime, and there were many things that they probably needed to do for building the cities of Pitom and Ramses. And it could be that brickmaking is tied to spring, and that plays the role of the Pesach story being a springtime activity, and also Rabbi Akiva's opinion in the Gemara that the Geula in Egypt took a whole year to run its course. So here's the start of it, and by the time spring rolls around again the next year, that's when we find Bnei Israel leaving Mitzrayim. With regard to the plagues, you mentioned about the houses, but in architecture there's a concept of planning for natural disasters that occur not frequently. So, like, you'll plan something for a storm that'll happen once every 20 years, or once every 50 or 100 years. It's called a 100-year storm, which meaning, like, the type of intensity that you get only once every 100 years. And when natural disasters do happen, there's usually some accrued knowledge that exists in the society for how to deal with them, what to do in the case of a flood or a tornado or a tsunami or an earthquake that doesn't happen that often. So in the case of the plagues, one of the major problems that the Egyptians have in dealing with the plagues is that these are not phenomena that they're used to. And they're not equipped to deal with them. And we see this as the Egyptians attempt to deal with the frogs, where they take the dead carcasses and they pile them up, and it ends up making the problem worse because then there's this great stink. We talk in the Seder about how each plague was really several plagues all at once, and I think this might be part of that point, that in the aftermath of the main plague, there's the widespread breakdown as they attempt to deal with the fallout from whatever happened. The plagues are still part of nature, but they're just massively unlikely events. So even if there are, quote, natural disasters, they're still impossible for the Mitzrayim to deal with, and they upset the Egyptian worldview of dependable natural cycles. In the connection with the laws of Shabbat and carrying Dalet Amot, 4 cubits, so I talk about the famous Vitruvian man. Vitruvius described the proportions of the human body with a height and wingspan equal to 4 cubits. And this is, of course, why the measurement for personal space in regard to, I mean, not Vitruvius, but because this was the idea that people took up 4 cubits of space. And that's the same idea that we see in the discussion of in Shabbat as why that's the amount. And it was also interesting to deal with this, to be editing this book during COVID, when they were telling us all to keep 2 meters apart from one another, which is, again, the same measurement that comes up with our wingspan and our personal space. And all of this is in the early Parshiot of Shemot, before we even get to the Mishkan. The Mishkan was actually, a bit of a challenge, since it's one of the architectural topics that actually gets discussed a lot. I didn't want, to get too much into material that there are really books upon books that are written about Batei Knesset, about synagogues, and about and about the tabernacle. I didn't want to just be rehashing topics that have been extensively covered. But of course, once we get into the Mishkan, I also have plenty of topics to discuss there.
So you mentioned before some of the sources that you used. You started off with the Rishonim, the Basic Mefarshim, and obviously, not obviously, I shouldn't assume this. Do you use architectural sources? What are general the sources that you use?
Good question. So, okay, let me start a bit with my educational background. I went to architecture school first in University of Michigan, and then after I made Aliyah, I had to complete an Israeli degree also, which I did at Bezalel Academy for Art and Design. In architecture school, I was always intrigued when topics that we discussed, I don't know, I guess this is just how my mind works, that whenever there was a discussion that there were what I viewed as parallel discussions that existed in the Talmud, it was always very exciting for me. I'd started learning Daf Yomi years, when I was in high school, and by the end of college, I wanted to find, when I was done with architecture as a notoriously time-consuming field of study. So when I was done with college and I had a little bit more time, I wanted, in addition to Daf Yomi, to be able to have something more be'iyun, something more in depth to get into studying. And I thought it would be interesting to research and write about architecture and rabbinic literature. And from the start, I looked at this as a project to arrange it as a Parsha project. But at the same time, I was indexing architectural topics that appeared in rabbinic literature. So I went through the Mishnah, Tosefta, both Talmuds, and the different books of Midrash Halakha, and many of the books of Midrash Haggadah, Mishnah Torah, and always, keeping indexes of different architectural topics that came up. When researching specific psukim, I brought in many classical perushim, and I have a couple of binders with pages that each cover, one topic, where I would add sources to each topic as I came across them. At the same time, I was focusing on scholarly books and articles about architecture in antiquity. With architectural history, one always begins with Vitruvius, which we mentioned. It's also, you'd let off by asking whether or not anybody has ever done this before. It's worth mentioning Samuel Krauss, who first wrote in German and then also in Hebrew. He wrote a book, a few volumes of Kadmoniot Talmud over a century ago, not as a parsha book, just as a collection of different architectural topics that appear in the Talmud. Daniel Sperber deals with a dozen or so architectural topics in his book, The City in Roman Palestine, so that was useful. And he was also kind enough to write a blurb for the back of my book. Archaeological books from that point of view in the Roman and Byzantine world, in that period, there's a volume of Yoram Tzafrir's Eretz Yisrael from the destruction of the Second Temple to the Muslim conquest, which was useful. That's a general survey of there's a general survey of the biblical period called Architecture of Ancient Israel from the prehistoric to the Persian periods, which was edited by Aaron Kempinski and Ronnie Reich. Reich is also not an expert in mikvaot, and he wrote a book about that. And so here, there were also a number of books that deal with specific building types in antiquity that were very helpful, whether that's domestic architecture. There was a book by Yitzhar Hirschfeld that's written in Hebrew and in English. Aqueducts, mikvaot, mentioned by Ronnie Reich. Theaters by Arthur Siegel. Burial practices, fortifications. So those books are all very interesting because they usually survey the archaeological evidence, but then usually in most of them there appears a chapter that deals with the rabbinic sources as well. So those were interesting too. And a bunch of other interesting topics that came up along the way, and researching articles about each specific topic as I got to it, whether it's like how color affects appetite or the use of water in Greek temples, and of course classical architectural authors like Le Corbusier, Adler and Sullivan, Adler being the son of an Orthodox rabbi from my hometown of Detroit, Kenneth Frampton, all sorts of names that will be familiar for people who've studied architecture and will be interesting for people who haven't. So after all of this research, eventually I paired up the architectural topics with the Torah portions, and that's what formed the framework of my book.
So I think that brings us to the final question, which is, who is this book meant for, and will a layman be able to enjoy and appreciate the book? Because I'm sure many of the listeners here are like me, a layman when it comes to architecture, and are probably wondering, well, is this book for me? Who's this book meant for?
Well, you're a layman, but you've lived your entire life in architecture, so you do have a fair amount of experience being in it. Architecture, in my experience, has a vast appeal to a wide audience. Many people have told me that at one time or another they wanted to be an architect. The smart ones then go on to something else, and the people like me, who are obsessed, stick with it. Maybe that's the Lego influence, I don't know. But regardless, we all live in a built environment, so I think that there is broad interest in thinking about buildings and design. At the same time, I know all too well that architects are notoriously poor writers, for the most part, especially when they get deep into theory, and I wanted to make sure that the topics that I covered were clearly explained for the layman, without relying on insider jargon or making things overly obtuse. So everything is explained in plain English, and if there are terms that are important, I make sure to explain them as well. I think the book will appeal to people curious about architecture, who are also looking for or people who are looking for a unique exploration of Torah. There's no special architectural knowledge that's really necessary to understand the book. And as a secondary audience, I hope that it'll be useful for people who are researching architecture, but who are unfamiliar with rabbinic sources. So I arranged the book in a way that it would be useful for that audience as well. Of course, there's a special thrill for people who are actually in the field to have a book that covers so many of the subjects that we deal with on a day-to-day experience. And a lot of people have, approached me and said it's wonderful that, that there's a book that discusses, these things that we work with on a regular basis. But equally as much, I think it's enjoyable for people who are not in architecture. And it's written not to be an insider book, but to be for everyone. Definitely no special architectural knowledge is necessary.
Okay, well, Josh, thank you for joining me. And for the listeners, there'll be a link in the show's notes. Anyone interested in checking out the book, you can purchase it via Amazon or wherever, the local bookstore, and there'll be a link. You can check that out. So thank you, Josh, for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.